Hi everyone. If I could just get your attention, please. We're going to start the panel. Thank you. There's one more panel left.
Believe it or not.
Saving the best for last, as always.
Hi, my name is Agata. I'm the president of the Student Animal Legal Defense Fund at Cardozo. Welcome to the Hot Topics in New York panel. Our first speaker is Jeff Price. He interned for the Animal Legal Defense Fund during his second year of law school, and after graduating, he became the litigation fellow there.
So I gave a version of this talk in California like 8 months ago, and I asked the audience how many of them were familiar with issues about carriage horses in New York City, and I would say actually maybe like 2/3 of them had read about it. It was a similar symposium. Probably 100 people in the room, half of them law students, half of them just sort of interested in animal advocacy, and like, as I said, maybe 2/3 had some familiarity with the issues. Here in White Plains, we're obviously a lot closer to Manhattan. So if I ask this group how many people have had exposure to the carriage horse issue in New York, how many of you would be able to raise your hands? Yes. Okay. So it'll be harder for me to pull the wool over your eyes today because you're personally familiar with them. But even if you weren't from New York, you might have had some familiarity, some exposure, because it's gotten some national attention, particularly with de Blasio's ambition to prohibit the industry. This is not Alec Baldwin. This is Jack Donaghy, who's a different person. This is his character on the show 30 Rock. And apparently, I think it was December of 2012, Donaghy, the character, had to take a ride in a horse-drawn carriage with his mother. And the person, Alec Baldwin, said, "Look, I don't want to do that, but I will do that on one condition, which is that you let me say about this what I want to in the character of Jack Donaghy." And who is it? NBC, I guess, thought about it, and they said, "All right, sure." So the character, Jack Donaghy, got to say that, with his mother beside him, that he hated what he was doing because the carriages were rolling torture wagons for nature's most dignified creature. So there you have it. On national television, the truth has already been told. My group, the Animal Legal Defense Fund, all of our peer organizations think that the only way really to protect the health and welfare of the horses who draw carriages in New York is to stop them from drawing carriages in New York. You can't regulate any more closely the health and welfare of these horses. You have to get them on the streets. Your best guess about when and where this is?
Broadway, 1926.
You're on the right track? Yeah, that's Fifth Avenue in 1909. So maybe it was safe at one time to be a horse drawing a carriage in Manhattan. And this is before the present day form of the industry actually existed. You'll hear industry hacks saying that this industry is 150 years old or whatever figure they're saying. How could you eliminate something with such deep roots in the city? It wasn't really an industry in 1909 on Fifth Avenue. It was a mode of transportation. So as a form of tourism, it's only existed since the 40s or 50s, when the mayors at that time first handed out what are still the only medallions that exist, 68 of them, to drag a carriage around the streets of New York. Which button is it? This one? This one? This is what it looks like today, right? You've all seen it because you're all New Yorkers. The horses aren't working alongside one another anymore. They're working alongside taxis, buses, petty cabs. It's just a lot noisier, and we all know that horses are prey animals, and when a prey animal gets startled, what's it going to do?
Run away.
It's going to run. So with a horse, we call it bolting. When a horse gets startled, it bolts. And if you have a carriage shackled to you, and several people in that carriage, some of them children, or you have cars in the streets, that's a lot more problematic, not just for the horse, but for the people who surround the horse. But it's especially problematic for the horse, which is why my organization and other organizations have been involved in this. We'll not talk a lot about sort of the specific regulations in the day-to-day lives of the horses, but I'll tell two quick stories about horses who kind of exemplify this notion that it's sort of impossible to safeguard their health and welfare while still allowing them to work. This is a horse named Smoothie, who in 2007 was startled by a man who walked past the hack line who was beating, the New York Times said, a small drum. Just a small drum. I mean, you can imagine just sort of a toy drum. Enough noise to startle Smoothie so badly that he bolted, and he was strapped to his carriage at the time. So he took off with the carriage behind him. He ran through 2 poles on the sidewalk, and his body fit through those poles, but the carriage didn't. So he got stuck and collapsed, and while he was struggling to get up, he simply died of shock. So you can't regulate the startling out of the industry. So increased regulation isn't going to help Smoothie. This is Tickles. Anybody hear more recently about Tickles? Yeah. So Tickles, they found in his stall in Midtown in February. He was 3 days back from vacation. They thought that he had broken his leg, and it turns out that he had. So the veterinarian showed up. They took one look at his leg. And what do you do to a horse with a broken leg?
You shoot it.
Yeah, you shoot it, or you inject it. You do something to euthanize it. So Tickles, nobody's 100% sure how Tickles broke his leg, but the theory is that he got cast in his stall. And when a horse gets cast, that means that he's on the ground and has not enough space to get up again, and likely fractured his leg in his struggle merely to get back onto his hooves. It's very probable that that happened because the stalls in the Midtown stables are really quite small, probably half the size of stalls recommended for animals of this size, draft horses. If it's true, as the industry suggests, that they treat their horses like children, you would not expect to euthanize your child because they had somehow become unproductive. We could imagine sort of the humane retirement of a horse who could no longer generate profit. But with a working horse who can no longer work, you simply euthanize. So that seems to belie pretty strongly, I think, the claim that these horses amount to children for people in the industry. The carriage horse issue, you probably know, has really largely been one of personalities. There has not really been a lot of litigation. I'll talk a little bit about our efforts to find litigation and our failure to find litigation. More recently, there has been legislation, and everyone's very pleased about that. But by and large, this has been an issue for personalities. So, you know, beyond Alec Baldwin, PETA has lined up some other people to advocate on behalf of horses, and as PETA is wont to do, there's often a lot of skin involved in that advocacy. I have no idea who this person is or what her nudity has to do with advocating for carriage horses. Does anyone know Cornelia Guest? Some of you, yeah, who is she?
Like a personality. I mean, like a
She's what?
like a socialite.
A socialite? Okay.
Yes.
Well, I mean, she's the right kind of socialite. More nudity on behalf of horse-drawn carriages. This is Kristen Johnston. Anyone know her?
Third Rock from the Sun.
Is she on Third Rock?
She was.
Oh, brilliant. Okay. So she and Alec then see eye to eye. This person I know, Leah Michelle, came out on behalf of the horses. And then most recently, this woman came out on behalf of the horses. People know who that is. People are nodding. A New Yorker favorite. That's Martha Stewart, who wrote a public letter to the Department of Health asking that they investigate just how Tickles came to die. Because the records, as I say, only suggest that Tickles died having broken his leg, getting cast in his stall, but it's not 100% clear. So those are some of the personalities. Then there are the animal groups that have been involved in this. This is one of them, the Coalition to Ban Horse-Drawn Carriages. This is what Gary Francione would call a single-issue campaign, as opposed to a group like the ASPCA or the Animal Legal Defense Fund that focus on animal issues across the board. This is a single issue campaign run by a woman named Elizabeth Forel in New York, who's incredibly dedicated to this cause and has been working on it for a number of years. Friends of Animals has been involved. You guys met Adita Bertrand earlier this morning. Adita's done a lot of work on this campaign, particularly around press. She's at every press conference. And Adita is the person actually who introduced my organization to the coalition. Who else? NICLAS, you may know. New Yorkers for Clean, Livable, and Safe Streets. These are the people who actually organize every press conference. They have the closest ties to the mayor's office. And for an interesting reason, which is that they invested a lot of money in a Democratic mayoral primary in, I think, 2013 to defeat Christine Quinn, who I think was then the Speaker of City Council, because Christine Quinn was publicly in favor of the industry. And they figured if Christine Quinn becomes mayor, the possibility of banning this industry is going to be that much farther in the future. So they invested all this money. They got Quinn defeated in the primary. They got de Blasio elected in the primary, which made it possible for de Blasio to get elected in the general election. So now you have an animal-friendly guy in the mayor's office, which makes it possible for the city council to do something that they've apparently not sufficiently been pushed to do previously. So it's a kind of an interesting observation that animal advocacy happens, not just in litigation, not just in some of the legislation that Chris and Chloe were talking about, getting bills passed, getting bills defeated, and it happens even not just in electing the right people in a general election. Animal advocacy happens even at the level of a primary election, preventing the election of a candidate, which I think is interesting. So this is kind of, more recently the figure at the center of the controversy, the mayor himself, Bill de Blasio, who promised in a fashion maybe similar to Obama's promise that he would shut down Guantanamo on his first day in office. Mayor de Blasio told us that he would ban the industry during his first week. And then he made all of the animal groups wait 11, almost 12 months just to see a bill introduced. And man, did that make people nervous along the way. Obviously, he has a lot of priorities. There's a lot of work to do in New York City. But it suggests that when you promise big, you're going to have people waiting on you. And unfortunately, the fact that it took him so many months to get there gave the industry an opportunity, so to speak, to circle the wagons and to really kind of try to control the tone of what was taking place there. And then do people know who this is?
Speaker.
Yeah, that's the Speaker. Right, Melissa Martin-Fiorito, unanimously elected Speaker of the House in what, David?
Last year.
Just this past year. And she's a supporter. And in fact, when the head of the Committee for Consumer Affairs said that he would quash a ban bill in his committee, the Speaker said, all right, no problem, I'm going to find a different committee to move that bill through. So she's on our team. But as I said, the industry had many months to generate their sort of narrative about what would happen if de Blasio had his way. And they've not been foolish about it. They've gotten help. They have spent money. And so they've hired this outfit, the Cavalry Group. How many of you guys have heard of the Cavalry Group? All right, so several of you who are involved in legislation have heard of the Cavalry Group. The Cavalry Group is out of St. Louis, Missouri. You might not think that this would be a PR firm that an industry in New York might quickly look toward. So let's have a look and see, what do they stand for? Constitutional rights. Hey, we all like constitutional rights. That's pretty good, right? You can't argue with that. If the Constitution says you have a right to shoot your dog, that's pretty good. What else does the Cavalry Group stand for? Property, liberty. We all like property and liberty. We all like the Founding Fathers. This group seems pretty legit to me. Oh, okay. Animal ownership. Okay, now it's getting, maybe a little bit more caution. And then there's this, which is, there. What does Cavalry Group do? Well, they protect your animal enterprise from unlawful attacks by animal rights extremists, which is exactly what John Adams had in mind when he touted the virtues of property and liberty. So this is a group that the industry has hired, and it's been very effective. They have managed to capture, as all of you know, living in New York, some of the local media outlets, in particular the Daily News, which I think Ali Feldman said in an email recently, doesn't really do anything but run, what's the term, advertorials. You know, it's kind of an advertisement, it's sort of an editorial, it's certainly not news, but that's what the Daily News is giving us. And they generated this Save Our Horses campaign, which is really, I think, it's really strategic, because you would think Save Our Horses would be the kind of language that the advocates would use, and they kind of turned it on its head. So they've really been very smart about it. And this campaign that they ran, they were running these petition signatures in the paper every day for weeks or even months. And then, I don't know, I think it was 8 or 9 months ago, they took their sad few sacks of petitions. They had 40,000 petitions to City Hall, and during their own press conference or in their own coverage, they basically admitted defeat. They said the mayor isn't going to care anyhow, sort of, you know, kicking their stone on the way home. But, you know, like 40,000 signatures compared to how many people live in New York City alone. 8.5 million people live in New York City, and they got 40,000 signatures. Who knows how many of those 40,000 lived in New York anyhow. So the industry has had other sort of surprising spokespeople, like Liam Neeson, who kind of appointed himself the erstwhile spokesperson of the industry, visited the stables, talked about what upstanding guys these are, you know, sort of that Irish connection. He is absolutely the person who said that the drivers and owners treat the horses like their own children, which the Tickle story obviously, belies. He went on a Daily Show, I don't know, last year sometime to talk about a film of his, and it wasn't Jon Stewart, it was Liam Neeson who turned it around to talk about the carriage horse issue. And of course, Jon Stewart, we know, is sort of increasingly friendly toward the movement, and Stewart had done his homework. He knew about the size of the stalls, he knew about the work that the horses do, and he wasn't letting Liam off the hook easily. And he basically said, you know, it doesn't seem like a particularly meaningful life to me. So it was a great moment for us. These are members of the industry. The woman all the way to this side is their spokesperson, Christina Hansen. She's actually a pretty good spokesperson, to be perfectly fair. She's pretty savvy with language. But you can see that they, like the Daily News, they're kind of using tactics that you would otherwise associate, you know, with the animal advocates, right? That's our team. Edita Bergkrant is in that picture. No, she's not. She'll be in a later picture. But you can see, right? Like, not a big difference. Like, if you were just walking by on the sidewalk, you kind of have to look closely to know which team was advocating for what. So you know, that's how sort of grassroots action works. So I mentioned that my organization had sought litigation opportunities. The Animal Legal Defense Fund, we look for specifically legal opportunities to advance the interests of animals. We had hoped to litigate in a way that would illuminate the problems that horses suffer in New York City. We never found a litigation opportunity, to be perfectly fair. And you might ask, like, well, why didn't you just sue the drivers and the owners? Well, because it comes down to this legal problem that any law student in the room could name, which is that you need a cause of action. We simply didn't have a cause of action against the drivers and owners. Maybe false advertising or unfair competition, but that was going to be really hard to put together. It's not like the Endangered Species Act. It's not like one of these wonderful federal environmental statutes that provides a private cause of action for citizens. Obviously, these horses aren't endangered. They're in danger, but they're not endangered. So we had to find an opportunity. You might ask, why didn't we use the cruelty code? Henry Berg, who founded the ASPCA 149, almost 150 years ago, had carriage horses in mind when he drafted what is still essentially New York's cruelty code. Because you have words in that code like over-driving and overloading. Those words obviously apply to working animals and especially to the horses. So why didn't we use the cruelty code? It's the same problem. There's no private cause of action in the cruelty code. The A could use the cruelty code as a private cause of action. Now, I meant that in a good way, because Henry Berg wrote it that. I mean, Henry Berg was so friendly with the New York legislature that when he got the code passed, he also enshrined in the code the ability of humane societies to enforce it. But otherwise, it's left entirely to prosecutors, police forces to arrest, prosecutors to bring charges. ALDF couldn't do that, so we couldn't use the cruelty code, even though we might think it would apply in many situations. Instead, we found this thing that most states do have. In New York, it's under what's called Article 78. It's a common law writ of mandamus. I guess it's not common law anymore because they wrote it into their statutes, as some states have done. But a writ of mandamus is kind of in some ways a state equivalent of maybe like an administrative procedures kind of action where you sue state agencies for their failure to adhere to an obligation that accrues to them. So it's tricky to bring, though. You can't use mandamus against private actors. This is a public cause of action, something you can use only against the state. So who would we sue? Well, we'd have to sue the agencies who oversee the industry. And how do we know about this? How do we imagine that this might even be available to us? There was a guy in the late 90s named Mark Jernove. He was living here in upstate New York. Mark Jernove had documented many instances of animal abuse in Nassau County. He brought his evidence of abuse to the police in Nassau County, and the police always told him to go away, on the theory that they referred all animal abuse to the Nassau County SPCA. And Jernove said, well, that's all fine and good, but I'm bringing it to you, and you're the police. So he sued them in mandamus, and the trial court dismissed the case, agreeing with the police department that Mark Jernove had failed to state a cause of action under which he could get relief. The appellate court disagreed. They said, look, read the cruelty code. The cruelty code said that a constable or a police officer must summons or arrest someone who's violated the cruelty code. A humane officer may do so, but a police officer must do so. And on that basis, there's a binding legal obligation, and so you can use a writ of mandamus to try to get the agency to do what the law requires it to do. So the appellate court upheld it. And it was on the basis of the PD's claim that they actually had a policy of referring all of these complaints. Because you really have to show that the agency has truly abdicated its legal obligation. Incidentally, as an aside, this guy Mark Jernove died in I think July of 2013, and nobody noticed. None of the animal groups realized that Jernove had died, which was kind of sad and unusual because Mark Jernove was the same plaintiff in this very important case before the en banc DC Circuit, ALDF against Glickman, which enshrined, at least in the DC Circuit, the principle that a person has an aesthetic interest in the humane treatment of animals. In other words, you get standing to bring a lawsuit merely by showing that your moral and emotional sensibilities are violated when somebody treats animals inhumanely, where the law requires them to do differently. So it's sort of sad that nobody knew that this really key figure, some of us would think in a nerdy kind of way, had died sort of quietly. The trick with Article 78, as I said, is you have to find a binding legal obligation where there's discretion for the agency, no mandamus. You cannot get a court to tell an agency to exercise discretion, because that would violate separation of powers, and courts don't want to be in the business of telling the executive what to do when the executive should have opportunities to decide for itself how to invest its resources. So you have to find a binding legal obligation. So that's the first sort of legal hurdle. But after that, once you do find such an obligation, then you have this huge factual hurdle. Because you have to show as a matter of fact that the agency has abdicated that responsibility, has failed to fulfill that responsibility. So then you have to ask the question, okay, if this is what we're going to do, Article 78, writ of mandamus, how are we going to build that factual record? So one way is to get yourself an inside man. Get somebody on the inside to give you facts. This is not an inside man, but he could have been. He's inside the stables. Having an inside man is tricky though. You have to handle a whistleblower somewhat delicately. In particular, you have to make sure that you do nothing that would resemble a quid pro quo. Quid pro quo. Because if there is anything like compensation, mutual back scratching, you're going to find yourself on the wrong side of a RICO suit. As anyone who followed the ASPCA litigation against Spelled Entertainment knows. So, you know, our peer organizations now owe the circus many millions of dollars because they had an inside man with whom they made maybe some mistakes. We did actually have an inside man, but we parted ways for reasons that remain confidential. But we were appalled to learn from him the kinds of things that we were learning. So that's one way to build your factual record. Another way is to have outside men and women volunteers who are out there documenting violations. This is a picture where I said Adita featured. She's standing next to Tony Avella, who's a state senator out of Queens, I think. And then the woman to the other side of Tony Avella is Elizabeth Farrell, the woman who runs the coalition. So you could put volunteers in the streets to document stuff. I bet David has done a certain amount of that. Jay Schuster, who's not in the room, did some in the field documentation for us. So you know that's a second thing you can do. The third thing you can do is get yourself in your organization someone who can really expand your reach. Tom Linney is in many ways kind of the superstar of ALDF because it's his job to develop relationships with law firms across the country who, what do we have in our litigation team? 8 attorneys. Then we have several hundred attorneys in private practice with all the resources of their firms who take on cases and sort of multiply the size of our docket by 10. Tom found us this firm, I got the pictures backwards, but Winston & Strawn in New York City, we were working with 3 attorneys in New York. What they did for us was to get public records, which is how really any animal advocacy, public interest litigation is likely to begin. You have to know what the government knows when you're trying to build your case. So where are we trying to get records? Well, we need records from the people who know what's going on in the industry. Well, that's the ASPCA, because for many years they were really the agency mostly responsible for overseeing the health and welfare of the horses. Problem is, they're not an agency. They're this private organization, this incorporated entity, not a government entity. So they weren't subject to the public records law. We couldn't get any documentation out of them. Couldn't even subpoena them, I guess. We could have tried, but we're friendly, so it would have been silly to try to do that. The Department of Health. So we FOIA'd the Department of Health. We got several thousand pages of records from the Department of Health. We FOIA'd the Department of Consumer Affairs, several thousand more pages from the Department of Consumer Affairs. And remember, we're trying to prove abdication here, that the agencies responsible for protecting the horses have not done their jobs. When you get back several thousand pages about the job that they're doing, it becomes difficult to make an argument that they've not done their job, even if, as with the NYPD, they say that they have no records. All you've proven is that they have abdicated their obligation to paperwork. It's not the same thing as abdicating their obligation to enforce the law. But the NYPD did tell us that they had 0 records. They had conducted a very thorough search, and they found no records of their enforcement of any of the laws related to the carriage horses, which was kind of appalling to us because the cruelty code, for one thing, is among them, but the traffic laws apply just as well. So if you find a cause of action and if you can develop a factual record, you still have to ask yourself, should we sue? Are there political considerations that would counsel us not to sue? Do we open ourselves up to problems of any kind? like a RICO countersuit? Are there other reasons? Maybe you have a new mayor in town who might be upset, who has his own idea about how to accomplish this thing. So you still have to ask yourself, should we sue? And we did. We had an interesting debate with our friends at Winston & Strawn about whether or not we should still try to sue somebody over this thing. They didn't want to. Like, very conservative defense side firm said, you don't need to anymore. You have de Blasio. Why sue? Why bother? Well, we ended up suing the NYPD because they had said they had zero records of enforcement. So we thought, okay, well, this is one opportunity. We just sue them for records. This is one opportunity to show maybe there's under enforcement of this industry. We organized this press conference. There's Tony Avella again. There's me looking miserable next to Tony Avella. It was about negative 200 degrees on this press conference. I'd taken the red eye out of California the day before. The wind chill was about negative 4,000. So, we went to great efforts to tout the fact that the NYPD was claiming to have no records of enforcement, which we thought was a pretty good sign of abdication, but not a perfect one. How many reporters came to our press conference?
Probably none.
Yeah, more than zero, but fewer than 2. It was a total debacle. We had one AM radio reporter come out to our press conference. We had a story or two in the paper.
Who took the picture?
Who did take that picture? I don't remember. Might have been the reporter. I don't know. But that afternoon, I was back in the offices of Winston & Strawn because they had litigated the thing and were hosting me and were very kind to me. And my cell phone rang in the afternoon, and it was Allie Feldman, the woman I said who runs NICLAS. And Allie Feldman, who has the closest line on the mayor's office, said to me, "Hey Jeff, this is Allie Feldman over at NICLAS. Did you sue the NYPD today?" And I had to say yes, because we hadn't told her that we were going to do that. We weren't yet collaborating with them. And Allie was very cross with me, because like I said, you have a new mayor in town. She's handling the mayor, and the NYPD is kind of an extension of the mayor's office. So not to have handled this in a politically savvy way was very upsetting to Allie. But the outcome was we're now collaborating much more closely. So an interesting lesson in how that goes. So if we don't have a cause of action, like what else can we do? Like, oh, bummer, the Animal Legal Defense Fund, like, where's the legal hook? I don't know. I mean, do we want to drag the bad actors through the mud a little bit? This is Saverio Colarusso. Who knows what Colarusso did? December of 2013, this poor man was arrested, the only man, I think, in history, for abusing his carriage horse. The only time the cruelty code has been applied. Not true?
1947, I'll send you the case.
Good, send it to me. Was it an industry case? Oh, brilliant. Okay. Send it to me. Colarusso got arrested for driving a horse who was limping. And when the officers questioned him about it, he was like, "Oh, I don't know, but she's been limping for the last 3 days." Yeah. The New York Times covered it, which is really, really excellent coverage. So we could try to drag Colarusso through the mud a little bit, or we could try to drag Frank Luo through the mud a little bit. This is the knucklehead who had tried to pass off a 22-year-old horse as a 12-year-old horse. He changed the hoof number on his horses so he could keep on working the old horse. And the old horse was sick, had heaves, which is sort of horse asthma. And when the Department of Health sort of finally realized what was going on, they questioned him about it. He sold the old horse in the February of the year that he was questioned about it, and then a month later he sold the younger horse, basically disposing of the evidence, and the Department of Health was satisfied with that. It was really kind of appalling. But we've not gone out of our way to sling mud at these guys, because, that's sort of not what we do. But there are groups who are doing it, and I think it can be effective. The problem is that the industry, of course, will distance itself from these individuals and say, in the same way that CAFO will say, these 3 employees who were hitting cows with sticks, that's not us. That's not what we do. So, you know, in the case of Cola Russo, he had a public defender for his cruelty defense, which means like the union hung him out to dry, or maybe he wasn't in the union, but the industry hung him out to dry. I think that's very interesting. Like they moved really to distance themselves from him. I think that's quite telling. So if there's not this litigation opportunity, and nudity hasn't yet accomplished what you're after, you know, ultimately, really this is a legislative problem demanding a legislative solution, which is why everyone was so relieved when de Blasio finally introduced the bill last December. It's intro, what is it, David, 573? Yeah, so check it out. It promises the humane disposition of the horses, job retraining for everyone involved in the industry. It's truly not a labor issue, but that's the narrative that the industry managed to compile. There's other stuff I could say, but I've already taken more time than I have. But I'll just say, if you are New Yorkers, and I think many of you are, the battle line, the battleground right now is to persuade your council member to vote for 573 in the way we need it to be voted for. Because, as I said, it's a legislative problem demanding a legislative solution. And in a democracy, the legislative solution is delivered only by the majority. So if you happen to live in New York, do look up your council member and give them a call. Remind the council member that this is not a labor issue, and that New Yorkers are simply too good, are simply too sort of no-nonsense and pragmatic to have horses working in the very crowded streets of present-day Manhattan. So I'll leave it at that. There's my contact information.
I don't know what y'all want to do. It's kind of close to the end of the time here, so I'll show you a quick video probably, and then can touch on some things, but I'm not gonna. I don't know what you guys think. If it's worth, I can maybe just talk a little bit, and then we can kind of go straight to the reception or whatever you think.
Andrea she told me to cut it off at 5:30, but
Perfect.
whoever.
I'll talk backwards. I'll talk backwards for 3 minutes.
But I guess if anybody has questions afterwards, they could just come up to the speakers.
Cool.
Okay.
So yeah, so I'll just show like a quick video that kind of encapsulates kind of what all the issues are surrounding exotic ownership of dangerous wild animals, and then blaze through, and then we can go to the reception. And you've already heard me talk more than enough today. Let's see. And so, just to give some background, in addition to being ALDS Legislative Director, I'm the chair of the American Bar Association's Animal Law Committee. And the biggest utility that the ABA has and the Animal Law Committee has towards the larger field of animal law is passing these resolutions, which are sort of policy statements that are adopted by the full ABA. ABA has a very large membership, and they've got an impeccable reputation as being the sort of neutral arbiters of what they believe is in the best interest of the law. And so there's been about 2 or 3 of these that we've done so far regarding that the Animal Law Committee has done so far that have been adopted by the overall ABA. One was on including animals in disaster planning. Another was on due process issues and making sure that states, counties, municipalities don't pass laws that are discriminatory based on breed. So I happened, the incident you're about to see the video on occurred in Zanesville, Ohio in October 2011. And I happened to be overseas in Salzburg, Austria at the time. And it was the #1 international news story. CNN International, BBC World News, Le Monde, for about a good 2 or 3 days. The lead story every hour. And it kind of had a spin of another example of American excess. And it was just, no matter how you slice it, just an absolutely horrible, sad situation. And I had, up to that point, worked almost exclusively on companion animals in the animal law work that I had done. And I resolved that day to, like, it just made me so sad I wanted to try and do something to address that. So that was 3 years ago, so I wrote, or 3.5 years ago, I then drafted this resolution. And then it took 3 years to work its way through the ABA, and just last February, I'll show you, it was adopted. But this is what you're about to see is the report that led me to that. Sorry. So here's some of the examples of why these are an issue, and I'll just, blaze through here. Here we go. But this video is what I showed. You have to go through this intermediary stage before you're able to address the whole larger ABA. That was our council, and it's only a couple minutes long, but as a result of almost this video alone, we got a unanimous vote by the TIPS board.
Big cats on the loose in small-town America. Late tonight, Ohio authorities called off a hunt for the last of dozens of potentially deadly animals apparently set free yesterday by a preserve owner in a final desperate act before he took his own life. What followed was a tense, bloody, and highly surreal suburban safari with police officers using 911 reports as a modern way of tracking their disoriented quarry all over the county. Now they believe the last animal unaccounted for, a monkey, was only missing because he had fallen prey to a now dead tiger. Here's ABC's David Curry.
Who would have thought in Zanesville, Ohio, residents would see lions, tigers, and this bear caught on a cell phone wandering in the woods after escaping from a nearby property, along with dozens of others.
Yeah, there's a lion on Mount Perry Road in Gray Shot.
I just saw a wolf.
I think I just seen one. It's like a jaguar or a wolf or something.
It was around 5 last night, and the sheriff's department was launched on what became an unlikely big game hunt.
I had to run through a field. It was in a hay field.
Deputy Sheriff Jonathan Murray was one of the first to respond.
Unfortunately, had to fire on the wolf.
Who, after killing a wolf, stared down a black bear.
The black bear then did turn in my direction and ran directly towards me. I fortunately was able to draw my duty pistol, fired one shot, killing the animal instantly.
Then a lion crawled under a fence and started heading for a neighborhood. The deputy put it down too. It was just the beginning. The images are painful, disturbing. Some of the most powerful, majestic creatures on the planet gunned down, lying dead.
The events that happened last night were extremely unfortunate, and I feel like me and the other deputies were forced into this situation due to Ohio's lax laws in reference to exotic animals.
Ohio does have some of the most lenient laws on exotic animals, but when day broke this morning, the concern was not the law, but the fact that some of those animals were roaming in neighborhoods.
I haven't been to bed for 2 days.
Columbus Zoo Director Jack Hanna drove all night to the scene to try and help police.
I just hope there's not any lions and tigers and leopards out there, and a cougar. From my understanding, that might not be a good situation. If they did feed them the day before yesterday, we're still okay. If this goes another couple of days and there are some tigers and cougars out there running around, then that might not be a best situation.
There was no good count on how many lions, tigers, and bears have been killed, and how many might be roaming in the hills and woods, so schools were ordered closed, children told to stay inside. Those animals were released on purpose by this man, Terry Thompson. He was just released from prison for a gun felony. His wife, seen here hiding from cameras, left him a few months ago. Is that why he cut fences, gates, and released his 56 animals and then killed himself? Authorities were well aware of Thompson.
We've had probably about 35 incidents where we've been there, and various types of incidents involving animal cruelty, animals running at large, inhumane treatment, different things like that.
Thompson had 76 acres here in Ohio, horses up on top of the hill, the buildings where he kept the wild animals. And he was no stranger to people in this area. In fact, a lot of them had come to this farm to see the wild animals.
In Ohio, under current law, it's perfectly legal for someone to have a tiger, a lion, a green anaconda, an alligator, a crocodile. And it's because Ohio is the Wild West when it comes to private ownership of exotics.
The animals are being buried.
Yeah.
But does that bury what's happened here?
I don't think Larry buried what's happened here. I think this is one of the largest animal escapes in the history of our country. I know people can't understand why they were put down. I realize that, and my heart's ache with them. Here we have 18 Bengal tigers gone, and there's only 1,400 left in the world in the wild. I mean, this is beyond the tragedy for the animal world.
Jack Hanna says it's time that his home state, the United States, Do something about these magnificent creatures in private hands.
On my dead body, I'm gonna work as hard as I can to get this where this doesn't happen again in this state.
When it was all over, 49 animals had been shot and 6 animals had been saved, taken by Jack Hanna to the Columbus Zoo. Even activists say they understand.
Law enforcement agents were put in a horrible position. The real fault lies with the policy-making failures, that this sort of situation was allowed to exist in the first place. No one should have 50 lions and tigers and macaques and leopards at their home in Zanesville, Ohio.
The sheriff says he has no regrets.
There was not a doubt in my mind that if any of those animals got into our public, we were going to have some serious trouble. And to contain 56 animals in a situation the way we did, our guys are really dependent on it.
I'm an animal lover, grew up on a farm, you know, I've loved animals my whole life. But, you know, being a deputy sheriff, I was sworn in to protect the citizens of this county and community, and I feel that me and the other deputies did that by doing what we unfortunately had to do last week.
In Zanesville, Ohio, I'm David Curley for Nightline.
So it's amazing how well that encapsulates all the issues here. You've got problems, dangers to law enforcement. You've got public health and safety. You've got animal welfare concerns. You've got legislation being the root of the problem. What's terrible about, even worse about the Zanesville incident, is that it was entirely preventable. The year before, a guy named Brink Kandra was killed feeding his neighbor's bear. He had over 400 separate wounds on his body from this attack by the bear. 24-year-old was killed. So then then Governor Strickland passed an executive order, which was a full exotics ban, dangerous wild animal ban, was great. But then Tea Party darling John Kasich was elected governor, and he refused to renew the executive order, thinking all regulation equals bad, which is sort of a common mantra with that crowd. And so here you have, a mere matter of months later, this happens. So had Terry Thompson been even more imbalanced than he was, and had he not fed his animals for 2 or 3 days and let them out in the middle of the night, Governor Casey could have had a pile of human bodies there as a result of this, not just animal bodies, or non-human animal bodies. Even crazier twist to this, because it took so long, and then of course Governor Casey comes out with press release saying how we immediately need to address this issue, but it then took a very long time. And crazy code to this story is that his wife that you saw walking out with the coat over her head, the 6 animals that survived, she was able to get those back. Like a year later, because there were still no laws. So at the time, Ohio was one of only 6 states that had absolutely no restrictions or regulations regarding ownership of dangerous wild animals. Perversely, at the same time, Ohio was the only state in the country that had a ban on owning pit bull type dogs. So it's illegal against state law to own a dog that some sheriff's deputy thinks looks like a pit bull, but yet you can own a Bengal tiger, or a Kodiak bear, grizzly bear, or a wolf, or whatever. Pretty absurd. Thankfully, both of those laws have been changed, and things have moved forward. So now we're down to 5. Wisconsin is the next on the list that we're likely to pick off. We had a bill last year that we worked really, that the HSUS and I think the A was involved in, and we're involved in this year. We kind of got all the details worked out last year, but the clock kind of ran out. So we're going to take another run at it this year and just try and pick off these states. But I'm going to stick around if you have any further questions.
What are the other states?
What's that? So Wisconsin, Alabama, both Carolinas, and Nevada. Nevada's a tough one because you've got all the crazy entertainment industry there. But we've had very successful, Carney M, my number 2 and I, who was supposed to be here today, we went to, there's a county, there's a guy, get this, one guy in Las Vegas, outside Las Vegas, who himself has 46 lions. Ringling Brothers only has something like 31. So he originally got these from MGM Casino when they were sort of decommissioned. But then one problem you'll see with a lot of these exotics owners and these roadside zoos is that it's very expensive to care for these animals. So one of their biggest money generators is to take photographs with the baby lion or the tiger cub or whatever. But it's illegal. The USDA will not allow you to do that, I think, after 12 weeks of age with these cubs. So then they breed them so they can have the cubs make them charge $50 a photo or whatever. But as soon as they become 3 months old, they can't use them anymore, and it's even more expensive. It's just sort of like a pyramid scheme for themselves, and so they didn't sell those out to even less scrupulous folks. Yeah, it's horrible. But ending on a positive note, Ringling Brothers announced, so we started passing these bullhook bans where different cities, Los Angeles was the largest city to first do it about a year and a half ago, and then this year Oakland passed a ban. And what that says is you're not allowed to use, you're not allowed to use these, any sort of weapons or implements on elephants to control them, and you have to. So elephants are such these huge, massive beings that the only way to sort of have humans interact with them directly is to control them using these sort of weapons. And so by banning these weapons, you're essentially banning their use and exploitation in circuses and things like that, and little elephant rides. I was at one last Tuesday filming some footage, and it's atrocious. But based on that, there were some other organizations like, well, what are you doing? You're only banning things for one animal, and you're going to have to go all over the place. These aren't really going to have any effect. And Ringling flat out said in their, I think it was March 5th, that it was because of these bullhook bans, and it was going to make it so difficult for them to travel around that they're just finally going to retire all of their elephants. There's people I know who've worked on that issue for decades and thought they would not see that happen in their lifetime. And then quickly, a month later, recently, Cardin Circus, that provides a lot of the shrine, you see these shrine circuses that happen all over the place. They're the ones who provide the elephants there, and they said they're retiring their elephants as well. And then taking it a step further, San Francisco just last week passed a full ban on using any wild or exotic animals in any form of entertainment. So there is progress, and again, it's sort of this death of 1,000 paper cuts. It only took a few to get Ringling to fold. Feld Entertainment, or Fold Entertainment. But the problem is it still exists. So there's a lot of other groups out there that are still, there's still some of these shrine circuses. There's Universal Circus, which just came to New York City at the Barclays Center, I think. And the headline of the Dodos article was, elephants seem dazed and confused and out of their minds during performance. So I just don't want to, I want to say, even though it's really great positive news, I don't want people to think that the battle's over now that Ringling's decided to change their mind. There's still a lot of work out there to do. But thanks a lot. You've been great.
So I just want to say thank you to all of our speakers that were here today and all of you that attended. I would also like you to invite you to join us for the reception, which will be in the tutor room where we started the day. There'll be some